So if you call this film overrated in the title, then you have to start the review by doing a heck of a lot of damage control. So let me just say first of all, watch part 1 and part 2 of this series, because in part 1 of this series I say that I consider the first 3 Harry Potter films to be really, really good, meaning including this one. So I don't think that I'm going to argue that The Prisoner of Azkaban isn't really, really good, but obviously I'm going to argue that this film isn't the best Harry Potter film, and therefore I need to address the number one reason people give for liking this film. The film has a real director, by which I mean this film has a director of whom it can be said that their filmmaking is an art. Alfonso Cuarón makes films of a reasonably consistent quality and actually does interesting things with the camera. When I hear Christopher Columbus is directing a film, it doesn't fill me with excitement, because Chris Columbus isn't a particularly artistic director. And I should clarify that when assessing films, I pay special consideration to film as an art form. I like to watch films that do interesting things with the camera and the acting and the set. My favourite film of all time, for example, is A Serious Man, because the film is a work of art. The Chamber of Secrets, by contrast, is not a work of art, and yet despite this, I consider The Chamber of Secrets to be the best Harry Potter film. While I hate to say it, but I consider A Serious Man to be an absolutely terrible Harry Potter film. Because just saying a film is well directed does not a good film make. When we're dealing with fantasy adventure, the quality of the directing is infinitely less important than the quality of the story. Yes, of course, good direction can communicate a story more effectively, but truly artistic direction could easily ruin a fantasy adventure film by making it more about the filmmaking than the plot. I don't want to see Wes Anderson direct a Star Wars film. This shot right here is probably the single most interesting, technically impressive and artistic shot in the entire Harry Potter franchise, and yet you could remove it entirely and it wouldn't be a worse Harry Potter film. This is why I am totally comfortable discounting the quality of Cuarón's directing as a means to determine how good this film is as a Harry Potter film. How can we determine the quality of this Harry Potter film? The same way we have the last 2 times, by assessing the internal plot and the way that plot impacts the wider narrative. Now I've done this twice now, so I might as well do it a third time and ask what is this film about, before pointing out that the film tells us what it is about. It's about The Prisoner of Azkaban, also known as Sirius Black. So let's look at how the film handles this plot. Before we do, it's worth noting that this film has a whole load of plot threads running through it, which we'll get into, and can also be split into 2 distinct parts. So I'm mostly going to be looking at the first half first and the second half second. Unconventional, I know. Now, the first Sirius Black related thing that happens is that Harry gets on the night bus, which is a really fun scene, and he sees on a newspaper that Sirius Black has escaped from prison. We're also told he is the most evil murderer ever, so we can be assured he is a threat. Later on, Mr. Weasley tells Harry not to go looking for Sirius Black, because Sirius Black is a servant of Voldemort, who wants more than anything to kill Harry. Only a few minutes prior to this though, this dude is quite evasive when it comes to how Black presents a threat to Harry, so it creates the idea that there is something more going on. Now this film hasn't been overly quick to inform us that Harry's life is in danger, but that danger is definitely reaffirmed when Harry gets his fortune read, and it is an omen of death, the Grim. And this is where I backtrack and acknowledge that yes, of course, the night bus isn't the first time we see Sirius Black. The first time is when he, in dog form, creeps out Harry just before the night bus shows up. However, we as the audience do not know what this dog is, and the Grim Omen is a clever misdirection, as it means we can assume that this dog is perhaps just a vision, whether magical or mental, that reaffirms the danger to Harry's life. And this danger is made more real when the fat lady is attacked by Sirius Black, and to be honest, I wasn't sure why he did this, and I thought it was just a plot hole designed to make him seem like a threat to Harry. However, in fact, of course, he was looking for Scabbers to kill him. But because this is perceived as an attempt to kill Harry, the Gryffindor students are housed in a safe hall. While Harry lies in bed, he overhears Snape talking about his suspicions that a particular member of staff may have helped Black into the school. He is of course referring to Lupin, and I think it's worth taking a break to look at Professor Lupin. So Lupin is very obviously a werewolf. His boggart is the full moon, and when Snape replaces Lupin briefly as Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher, he teaches them about werewolves. Since there's no such thing as a class that doesn't advance the plot in the Harry Potter universe, it's pretty clear that somebody must be a werewolf, and it's quite obviously Lupin, and I'm not even going to bring up the nominative determinism. What's kind of weird about this whole werewolf subplot is that it doesn't have much to do with Sirius Black, except that it introduces the concept of an animagus, which is a wizard who can turn into an animal, thus explaining why Black and Pettigrew can do so. Anyway, so the important thing is it's a Hogwarts Christmas. which is the height of wholesome. And speaking of wholesome, we get some good old-fashioned fun with Harry trolling Malfoy epic style with his invisibility cloak. Later on, he hears some people talking about Sirius Black, so he goes to investigate with his invisibility cloak. This actually demonstrates one problem with this plot. There really isn't much investigation. The plot is about Sirius Black, but Sirius Black is the only one being active, and Harry even dismisses the idea of going after Black himself. There are very few scenes of the protagonists actually investigating and researching and coming up with plans like they were in the first two films. So Harry follows these people and they just explain how Sirius Black betrayed his parents in one big exposition dump, where we also find out that Sirius Black is Harry's godfather. Feeling upset at this shocking news, Harry runs off and cries under the invisibility cloak because Daniel Radcliffe can't cry on command. At this point, he threatens to kill Sirius. Now, I just criticised this film because the actors weren't active, and you might think him vowing to kill Sirius would make him more active, but it doesn't because he literally says that he hopes Sirius Black finds him.
I hope he finds me.
Anyway, so Harry goes to his divination class and sees Black in a crystal ball before the scariest thing ever happens. But that's it as far as Sirius Black in the first half goes, and you might notice it seems kind of sparse. In the first film, they were constantly looking to find out more about the Philosopher's Stone and who was trying to steal it. In the second film, they were constantly looking to find out more about the Chamber of Secrets and who is opening it. But in this film, they are aware of the prison of Azkaban, but they're just kind of doing nothing as the plot happens around them. In case you can't tell, I'm a bit disappointed. I do have one immediate suggestion as an improvement. They should have introduced Sirius Black very early. It should have just been common knowledge that Sirius Black murdered Harry's parents, or at least that Harry's parents were betrayed by their best friend. In the former case, we do miss out the big reveal, but personally I'm kind of okay with that. If you want the reveal, then we could retain the fact that Harry's parents were betrayed, but have the reveal that Sirius Black is the one who betrayed them saved for later. Either way, this would mean that we already accept that Sirius Black is a really evil person way in advance, so we immediately understand how serious it is that Black has escaped. As things stand, we find out that Sirius Black betrayed Harry's parents at the hour and 5-minute mark, and we find out that he didn't actually murder Harry's parents at the hour and 35-minute mark. So we are only given half an hour of actually believing that Sirius Black is this evil, treacherous person, when that could have been something that was already established right from the moment that Hagrid explained what happened to Harry's parents back in the Philosopher's Stone. And then, of course, when Harry finds out that Sirius Black has escaped, he could see it as an opportunity for vengeance, and that could be the main focus of the Prisoner of Azkaban, focusing on Harry wanting to find Sirius just as much as Sirius wants to find him. Instead, Harry doesn't even know who Sirius is at first, and then dismisses the idea that he'd be especially interested in who Sirius is, then only finds out who he really is an hour into the film, before finding out half an hour later that actually he's a really good guy, and 5 minutes later, he's totally down to live with him. Pardon me while I reaffirm my disappointment with this story arc. So what is actually providing most of the action in this film at the beginning? The Dementors, and to be honest, that's not much better. I do like the fact that they are there because they are looking for Sirius Black, which at least means they tie into the main plot, but not really in a way that justifies them being such major antagonists, since they're supposed to be there to help Harry. The Dementors provide us with one of our earliest intense encounters in a Harry Potter film. They haven't even gotten to Hogwarts yet, and Harry has already nearly lost his soul to something that looked like death. And consider for a minute the fact that if Lupin hadn't been there, Harry would have just had his soul eaten, which seems to be a permanent state, which is allegedly worse than death. And Harry could have suffered that fate just because this school can't keep its Dementors in line. It kind of fails to suspend my disbelief. At several points in this film, Harry's life is seriously endangered just because of the stupidity and negligence of those who are supposed to be on his side. Like, let's talk about this Quidditch scene. Firstly, I feel like the snitch shouldn't be able to get this high up and this far away from the stadium, since I'd imagine that's just asking for trouble, health and safety wise, and also would make for a less interesting match to watch. Maybe the snitch has been hexed. But either way, Harry gets attacked by a Dementor and nearly falls to his death. He could have died, and again, it's not because of some serious antagonistic force, but rather just because the school has hired some shitty security guards. Compare this to the other two Quidditch matches from the other two films. In the first one, Harry's broom is being bewitched by a dark wizard trying to kill him, whom the gang mistake for Snape. Therefore, the gang must be proactive in saving Harry's life. In the second film, Harry is attacked by a bewitched bludger, which is intended to scare him away from Hogwarts before Hermione saves his life. In this version, it's just an issue of the staff, really. So I wasn't that enamoured with the Dementor subplot, and I'm afraid things aren't going to get better because now we have Buckbeak. Now, I don't hate Buckbeak. However, it's important to understand that Buckbeak is not that integral to the plot. I said earlier in this review that we never have classroom scenes that don't advance the plot. And that's only true because this doesn't technically take place in a room. Now you might say, but it does advance the plot because Buckbeak is used later on to free Sirius Black. But having a separate plot that eventually is used to advance the main plot isn't the same as having it be intertwined with the main plot. I'm not necessarily saying I hate this subplot, because I actually think it's quite nice. However, it ultimately serves to demonstrate how little of this story is actually dedicated to exploring the main thrust of the narrative. Yes, Malfoy gets attacked by Buckbeak, and Buckbeak gets sentenced to death, and Hagrid is sad about it, but this is all just stuff that is happening at the same time as the main plot, and that isn't the best method of storytelling. Now, there is one other area where this film has a serious flaw, and that flaw lies in the time travel plot, and the way that impacts the story. Firstly, the climax of the film essentially happens twice, and secondly, the film essentially ends halfway through its running time. What do I mean by that? Well, in The Philosopher's Stone, I'd say that the film begins to end when the characters resolve to go after the Philosopher's Stone that night.
Go down the trapdoor. Tonight.
This happens at approximately the hour and 55-minute mark, meaning that up until this point we've had a period of time longer than the runtime of many films. In The Chamber of Secrets, the end of the film begins when they discover Ginny Weasley has been captured and resolve to go after her, which happens at exactly the 1 hour and 55-minute mark as well. So, when does The Prisoner of Azkaban begin to end? Well, I think it's pretty obvious that the beginning of the end is the point they travel back to, which is when Hermione confronts Malfoy. And this happens at about the hour and 20-minute mark, meaning that we haven't even had a feature-length film's worth of plot before the plot essentially starts winding down. There is another difference between this film's ending and the endings of the other two films. In the other two films, the characters themselves resolve to confront the final obstacle, whereas in this film, the characters are essentially attacked and dragged off by the final obstacle. Yes, I'll admit the characters are at least proactive in going back in time to save the day at the end, but firstly, it can't be ignored that this is after the climax of the film has already happened once. And the way that time travel works in this world creates a problem, because clearly it's what I believe is called a closed-loop timeline, meaning in other words that they travelled back to the past as the past was happening, thus causing their future interventions to happen as the first timeline plays out, or as Harry put it.
I knew I could do it this time because, well, I'd already done it. Does that make sense?
No!
The only reason this bothers me is that since the timeline has already happened once, we know that every action they take is already predestined to have happened. So, can we really give them credit for being active protagonists? Okay, so while I'm talking about time travel, let's talk about the Time Turner, since that's another plot thread in this film. At various points in the film, Hermione appears suddenly in the classroom. She isn't here, but she is here. She isn't here, but she is here. She isn't here, but she is here. And each time, Ron points out that she has appeared effectively out of nowhere. This implies that there is something up, and there is an additional mystery surrounding how Hermione is able to take multiple classes at once.
That's not possible. Ancient runes are the same time as divination.
Now, I have a question. Why does having a Time Turner cause her to magically appear? Because let's imagine how this would play out. Say she has two subjects, ancient runes and divination. So first things first, she starts off in Gryffindor Common Room and goes to ancient rooms. Once this class is over, she disappears somewhere private, like a girl's bathroom, and uses the Time Turner to go back 1 hour, at which point she walks out of the bathroom, avoiding her past self, and goes to divinations. Now maybe you'll say that she in fact finishes ancient runes, then goes to divination and goes back 1 hour, thus causing her to magically appear in divination 1 hour earlier. But at that point I have to ask, isn't that much more likely to bring attention to her time travelling? Would she not be cautioned against magically appearing in the middle of classrooms? It doesn't matter. Anyway, let's look at the actual end of the film. So first of all, Hermione punches Malfoy, because it's always okay to punch a Nazi. Then they go to see Hagrid, who is very upset about Buckbeak being put to death. It's worth noting this is the only reason they go to see him, because they've got no investigating to do. So Hagrid returns Scabbers to Ron's possession and they head off, where they hear the sound of Buckbeak being killed. Suddenly, Scabbers bites Ron's hand and runs away. They run towards the Whomping Willow and are accosted by the Grim, who drags Ron away into the roots of the Whomping Willow. This explains why this film has so many Whomping Willow establishing shots at least. Because now Harry and Hermione have a fight with the Whomping Willow before they can go down the tunnel to follow Ron. At which point they find themselves in the Shrieking Shack, which we saw Hermione and Ron looking at previously. Now, we have a whole load of ambiguity to ramp up the prospect that Sirius Black is going to murder Harry, which I have to say would have been helped if Sirius Black had been introduced in an earlier film. I'm willing to accept that Sirius Black is being ambiguous because he's slightly crazy, but later on he does seem to become non-crazy. So through all this ambiguity, it's implied that Sirius Black wants to kill Harry and that Lupin is a traitor, at which point Snape shows up and saves the day. What a hero. Harry then attacks a teacher with very little justification. I mean, he really has no reason to assume that Snape is in the wrong here, and it's kind of a shame because this should be a moment where, again, Snape's commitment to actually fighting against the bad guys is made clear, but instead he sort of just looks like a loser who gets taken out by a 13-year-old. And then we find out that the real person who betrayed Harry's parents was in fact Peter Pettigrew, who's been living as a rat this whole time, and also looks a lot like a rat. So let's talk about Peter Pettigrew. So first of all, there is a frequent motif of Ron not being able to find Scabbers and Ron being concerned that Hermione's cat is going to eat Scabbers. This on the surface means very little, but of course, actually, that rat is Peter Pettigrew. You see, Harry tries to go to Hogsmeade and he is given a map by Fred and George which allows him to explore Hogwarts with real-time updates on the locations of various people. This is all fine until one day he sees Peter Pettigrew on the map. Curious, he gets up to explore, and to be honest, I remember thinking to myself, oh great, Harry's going to investigate something. At the hour and 15-minute mark. Little did I know we were literally 5 minutes away from the film beginning to wrap up. Anyway, so Harry sees Peter Pettigrew on the map, but he doesn't see Peter Pettigrew in real life, even as he goes right past him, because Peter Pettigrew is in fact a rat. However, after this, Snape shows up, and I have to say it's pretty stupid that the map displays a message at all when asked to reveal secrets, since it turns what would otherwise be a blank bit of parchment into something that is clearly a secret. Anyway, so Lupin then rescues Harry and explains that he is angry at Harry for walking around the school at night,
and gambling their sacrifice by wandering around the castle, unprotected with a killer on the loose, seems to me a pretty poor way to repay them.
And I appreciate the concern he showed. However, I have some objections. I think Peter Pettigrew should have been a much bigger part of this plot. So Sirius Black should have been mentioned several movies ago, so we would already know he is a villain and is bad news. The fact that he killed Peter Pettigrew could be news to Harry, which prompts him for some reason to investigate. Now, I do not claim to be creative enough to know what exactly Harry should be investigating, but something that would involve him relating to Peter Pettigrew, thus making this reveal a bit more interesting. This isn't to say that it is uninteresting, but it could have been more interesting. And finally, I can't help but feel this whole thing is a bit contrived. If Lupin knew that Scabbers was Pettigrew, as we can assume he did, then why wait for this moment? He could have killed Scabbers at any time while he was a teacher, but also, surely he could have told Dumbledore this information. Dumbledore could be relied on to take the claim seriously, but instead they do the old drag Ron to the shrieking shack trick. Anyway, so it seems like everything is basically okay now, since Peter Pettigrew is caught and Sirius Black can be released. But then of course Lupin turns into a werewolf, and Peter Pettigrew escapes. This does feature a pet peeve of mine, which is characters not running away while the monster is distracted, but fortunately, they are rescued when Lupin hears a werewolf calling. Harry runs to help the injured Sirius, at which point they are set upon by Dementors, who really seem like more trouble than they are worth. They are very keen to suck out people's souls, is all I'm saying. So, at the last minute, they are rescued by a Patronus, but Harry is put in hospital while Sirius Black is arrested. I must admit I find it weird that Harry couldn't testify what he saw and at least ensure that Sirius Black is granted some leniency. I'm not suggesting they'd release him on the testimony of a 13-year-old boy, but they could at least hold off from the killing. If somebody is willing to testify under oath that the person who allegedly murdered their parents did not in fact murder them, and instead they were murdered by a man who faked his own death and disguised himself as a rat, then that seems like the kind of story that wouldn't be made up, especially seeing as he'd have two other wizards corroborating it, and Lupin, who may not be considered as reliable since he was a friend of Sirius, but still. Anyway, doesn't matter. They decide to go the time travel route. Of course, in the last film, it was Ron and Harry with Hermione incapacitated. Now it's Harry and Hermione with Ron incapacitated. Great times. So basically, it's worth just going through all the ways that they influence the past and how that explains previous events. Firstly, we have Hermione throwing the pebbles, which alerted them to the executioner. Then we have Hermione making a comment which causes the previous Hermione to think she just saw something. Then we have them leading away Buckbeak, which causes the executioner to hit a pumpkin instead. And then we have the "awoo" noise that saved them. And finally, we have Harry do the Patronus charm. I just have to say, Harry is pretty dense for not realizing it was him who did the Patronus originally. Like, you've just seen the explanation for all the other strange events, but you still think that your father is going to appear and do a Patronus because that's the only explanation for why you saw somebody who looked like you casting it. Idiot. Anyway, props to Dumbledore for distracting the executioner and his crew, and also props to the film for a genuinely intense scene with the werewolf in the forest. So, after all of that, they ride Buckbeak to rescue Sirius Black, and Harry gets a pep talk from Professor Lupin. So, about the internal plot. I had a lot of negative things to say, and I stand by every single one of them. The big twist is that Sirius Black didn't really betray Harry's parents, even though that's something we only find out halfway through the film. The other big twist is that Peter Pettigrew wasn't actually killed by Sirius Black, and that is also something we only find out halfway through the film. There are a whole load of different plot threads, none of which really involve the characters being active protagonists. And then finally, on top of all of this, we have the fact that the film ends twice and ends early. All of these are problems that weren't present in the first two films. Now, having said that, I do like how creative the time travel plot is. Yes, it created issues in the flow of the narrative, but it also made for an interesting premise, and for that reason alone, I'll give the film credit. But if called upon to give the internal plot of this film a rating out of 10, I mean, what can I say? On the surface, it's pretty clearly a 5 as far as I'm concerned, being filled with so many missed opportunities. However, based on the inventiveness of the time travel plot, I will bump it up to a 6 out of 10. Now, a 6 out of 10 for the internal plot doesn't mean I would give the film a 6 out of 10 because, like I say, there is more to the quality of a film than the quality of its plot. This includes, but is not limited to, the quality of the wider plot. So let's jump in, shall we? First of all, I have to say I will never tire of hearing the Harry Potter music when one of these films starts up. It fills me with such impossible amounts of joy. And as always, I enjoyed the stuff at the Dursleys, although it did seem very harsh this time, but whatever. The harsher they are, the bigger the comeuppance, and that's great as far as I'm concerned. It's also great to actually see Harry be angry. Before, he kind of just seemed to accept the shit that happened to him, but now he's actually showing visible frustration, and I like that. When he ran away though, it suddenly hit me how strange it is to just see unadulterated England with no magical elements to it at all. Oh, and a relationship between Ron and Hermione is hinted at again, based on how she grabs him in fear, so that whole narrative is advanced. But if we're going to talk about how this film advances the narrative of Harry Potter, then it's only fitting that we should talk about how this film advances the character of Harry Potter. And this is where I mentioned the one really good thing about the Dementor storyline, which I found to be a bit silly within the context of this film. However, within the context of the wider Harry Potter universe, it is great. See, Dementors tend to attack people who have dark histories, just like Muggle cops tend to attack people who have dark skin. This works really well as a narrative device as it lets us explore the character of Harry Potter. The Dementors leech onto Harry because of his dark past, and there is a reason why Harry is more afraid of Dementors than Voldemort. Voldemort is in the future for Harry. It is something he will have to face at some point. But Harry's greatest weakness is his past. How upset he feels at the loss of his parents. This is what the Dementors represent. So, when we watch Harry overcome this, first of all by conjuring up positive thoughts of his parents, and later on by conjuring up a powerful Patronus in a time travel plot, fittingly, it represents at least a partial defeat of the demons in his tragic past. This film does a really good job connecting Harry to his past, since the whole plot is about the man who supposedly betrayed his parents, limited as the film's focus on that plot point might be. Moreover, when Harry can't go to Hogsmeade, he speaks with Lupin, who reveals that he knew his parents and was a friend of theirs. This is the first time we've met somebody with such an intimate relationship to Harry's parents, and of course, it is then Lupin who trains Harry to overcome the Dementors. There is one thing conspicuously missing from this film though: Voldemort. In the last two films, Voldemort has been the bad guy, and the films have been about Voldemort coming to power. It's kind of surprising that Voldemort has literally nothing to do with the plot of this film, and I do think it could have helped a bit if Voldemort did have something to do with it. This film also doesn't explore anything about the relationship between Harry and Voldemort as previous films did. Having said this, the film does still contribute to Voldemort's storyline, since we know that one of his servants has escaped, and we could perhaps imagine that he is going to revive Voldemort. But again, I have a point about how this film could have been better. They should have made this film about a potential way of building Voldemort back to full power, with the implication that Sirius Black would try to bring Voldemort back to life, thus adding tension. And then of course, at the end when Peter Pettigrew escapes, we could assume he will use this method. So, to briefly summarise my broad rewrite, have Sirius Black be introduced in the Philosopher's Stone, so we already believe he is real. This way, the minute we see he has escaped, we know the score. Have the death of Peter Pettigrew be revealed slightly earlier in this film, and in some way relate Peter Pettigrew to some mysterious method to bring Voldemort back to life, so there is some clear relevance to our main antagonist. As much as I think the time travel plot comes with its drawbacks regarding pace and the like, I'd still say you can keep it. Maybe add more to the beginning of this film, so it's as long as the previous films, and at that point you have the film wrapping up at the hour and 45-minute mark, which gives much more time for actual mystery before that point. Anyway, one more point regarding contribution to the overall story. Introducing Lupin and Sirius Black are both important additions that will come to be relevant later on in the plot, which, all in all, makes this film pretty indispensable. With this in mind, I'm going to give this film an 8 out of 10 for contribution to the overarching story, given the way it explores the character of Harry Potter and gives us a window into his past. But I can't ignore what I see to be some obvious missed opportunities. Now, I know I've been somewhat down on this film, but I should clarify I still like it and would definitely give it an 8 out of 10 overall when taking into account the quality of the filmmaking and the like. So, if that's the reason you like this film, I don't disagree with you. But based on my criteria, which is solely plot-based, I see this as a bit of a step down from the previous 2 films. It's worth noting that next week and next installment, we will be delving into the films which I consider to actually be bad, so look forward to that. Until then, like if you liked, dislike if you disliked, constructive criticism always welcome in these comments, subscribe if you're not subscribed, share if you are subscribed, and also get the bell on, and follow me on Twitter.